Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to take in a formal dress at the waist. So this is a bridesmaid's gown and the client would like for it to be a little more fitted here at the waist. So I had her try it on and I put some pins here so where she felt that it was a good fit. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually measure where these pins are, write it down, take the average of both sides so that I know how much I'm taking away, then I can safely remove the pins, and then I'm going to rip this apart up here and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do next. Okay, so the first step is we're going to measure how much of this we're going to take out. So I have my sewing gauge here. You can use any type of roller. So she was happy with up here where it's at the underarm. She was happy with the fit there. So she just wants a little bit taken out here at the waist. So I'm going to measure how far down from the underarm this begins. Okay, so it's 3.5 inches down. Okay, and I'm going to write that over here. So I just write 3.5 inches down and how much is being taken out. So you can write this one of two ways. So if I measure from the pin over to the edge, looks like about 5/8 of an inch. So I can either write 5/8 of an inch or I can double it and write that because that's truly what we're taking out. I'm just going to write 5/8 of an inch, but whatever one you choose to do, you just want to remember that's what you are using as your method of measurement. Okay, so what I wrote down here is that 3.5 inches down from the underarm, I'm taking away 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so now let's make another measurement. So if I go to this next pin, so 5 inches down from the underarm is right here where the head of this pin is. So how far is that from the edge? That's 1 inch from the edge. Okay, so we'll write that down. So 5 inches down, 1 inch. Okay, and then when we go all the way down here, 6 inches down from the underarm, it's going to be right here. And how far is that from the edge? 5/8 again. So I'm writing 6 inches down, 5/8 of an inch. So this is just for your own use so that when you pull these pins out, you still have the information that you gathered when you had your client with you. Okay, so this is really all we need to know here. So we're taking out this much here, and then we just kind of taper it off. Okay, so that was the left side. Now we're going to do the same thing on the right side. And in theory, these really should be the same measurement or very close to each other. And if it's not exactly the same, we're going to take the average. So let's do this again. So we had our measurement of 3.5 inches down. We don't actually have a pin there, so we'll just kind of leave that one blank for now. Okay, so then 5 inches down. How far is that from the edge? Before we had 1 inch. And again, we have an inch, so that's a good sign. So let's look at 6 inches down, and before we had 5/8 of an inch. And this time we've got about 3/4 of an inch, which is only about 1/8 of an inch off. So I would say we are in good shape to go ahead and remove these pins and use our measurements here for how much of this we're going to be taking in. So our next step is to get our seam ripper, and we're going to be opening this up right here. So where the lining meets the outer material, we're going to open it up, and then we're going to be removing by sewing a new seam right here with this inside out on both the outer material and the lining, and then we'll put it back together. We'll do that for both sides. Okay, so here's our side seam at the lining, and this is the outer part. So I've got my seam ripper, and I'm just going to start picking this open here. And what we're doing is we don't need to actually open the side seam. We just need to remove the outer material from the lining. And then we'll need to make a new side seam for both the outer layer and the lining. So we just want to carefully pick the stitches out here. Let's open this up. Okay, we're starting to get a pretty good opening here, and now I have encountered a point where the lining and the outer are actually attached inside of here. So I'm just gonna go right ahead and open that up too. Again, our goal here is just to get the lining and the outer to be not connected at this part, so we can work with them separately. Okay, so and again, when I reach down in there, I can feel that this is the lining and the outer are attached. Or maybe actually, I think that's just my pins. Yeah, I can safely remove these pins because we wrote down their placement. Okay, so now I'm just gonna reach in here and see. Now I can't comfortably flip this yet, so I gotta keep ripping. But you don't want to rip too much because we will have to sew this back down, and we'll have to sew it probably by hand so that it doesn't show a visible stitch from the outer side. If you want it to look the way it looked initially, you'll want to close this hole by hand at the end. Otherwise, you'll see your machine stitches on the outside. So don't go too far. Just go as far as you need to so you can get this open. Okay. And this one's going to be a little different from most that I do because we are actually going to be taking out past the waistline. So when you look at a dress, you have the bodice, which is the part up at the chest, and then you have a waist spot, and then you have the skirt. And if we were only taking from the bodice, that would make it a little easier, but we actually are going to have to take into the skirt. So there will be a little more ripping down here. So let's see what we have going on down here. I'm going to unzip the back here. And I'm sticking my hand in the hole that we ripped so I can try to find how this is connected to the skirt. So that I'm not just ripping stuff that doesn't need to be ripped. I'm going to go ahead and try to flip it. Okay, so we're just going to have to rip where it comes together so that we can have the skirt lining to work with independently from the skirt outer as well. So just to make it so you can see this better, I know it's getting kind of crazy. This is still the side seam here, and this is where bodice meets skirt. So I'm gonna have to just open this up here. Really, we don't really need to open this seam. I just need to get this open in some way so I can see what's going on. So really, I guess if I flip it here, this is more what we need. This is where bodice meets skirt. I know it's hard to tell that right now, but it is. So sometimes you just have to rip things that aren't really what you need to open up, but you just have to start somewhere so you can see how it's constructed. And it's okay, as long as you're just ripping stitches, you can always put them back. Even if you have to do them by hand, it's okay. Sometimes you just gotta start opening it up to see how it's put together. Okay, so let's look from the outside. So I now have a hole here where bodice meets skirt, and I have bodice and lining outer here, which need to be completely separated, and they are not yet. So okay, they are. They are separated, so that's what we want. So if I stick my hand in the initial hole that we ripped up here at the underarm, I can go all the way down into the skirt, and I am only having on top of my hand the outer part of the bodice and the outer part of the skirt. And then if I look inside here, I have the lining part of the skirt and the lining part of the bodice. So we have successfully detached the two, and that's what our goal was, because we need to work with lining as one and outer as one and then put them back together. So let's go ahead and start with the outer part. So this hole that was created, the only reason I ripped that is so I could get the lining free from the outer, but it doesn't actually, it needs to be closed back up. So like not closed to the lining, but the outer needs to be put back together. But just so that this is more neat, I actually will take in from the bodice, then take from the skirt, and then I'll put them back together. And I might do it by hand, or I might be able to get in there. Actually, yeah, I'll be able to get in there. So, all right, so let's go ahead and flip this inside out. So this is going to be, it's kind of a challenge doing this because you don't have a lot of space, but you know, just work 1 inch at a time or whatever it is you can do. So let's flip this inside out and remember where the top is. So this is the top, and then I'm going to flip it, and I'm just going to pretend that I'm constructing this from scratch and that it's inside out completely. I know you're working with all this weird stuff. It's not going to be nice and flat like if you were doing it from scratch. It's not going to make a lot of sense. You might have to flip it right side out a bunch of times to make sure you're actually where you think you are on the dress. Okay, but all we have to worry about is just a few inches at a time, and we'll be okay. So I have the side seam here, and you can see I keep sticking my hand in here and flattening it to make sure when we run over this with the machine that it's not going to be like crinkled or folded in any way. And I'm going to place some pins. So here's the old seam, and ultimately what we're doing here is creating a new side seam. So up here's the underarm, and we're going to use all those measurements that we just took. So whatever 3.5 inches down from that underarm, and however far over it was 5/8. That's what we're going to be using here. So I'm just going to try to make this as flat and neat as possible and stick some pins so that we can have a nice sewing surface on this dress. And this one's actually not too bad. I'm actually able to flip it more because we detached it from the skirt. Sometimes it can be quite a challenge because it's just not flat, and you have to just work it however you can. Okay, so these are just my pins to hold this in place. I'm going to grab a few more pins to mark the placement of our new seam. And here is our measurement paper. Okay, so our first piece of information we have is that 3.5 inches down from the underarm, we're taking 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so underarm's up here. And this is where we're measuring from is the actual stitching line, not the raw edge, because the raw edge is not visible from the front. The stitching line is what determines where the actual top of the piece was. Okay, so measuring from the stitching line and straight down, 3.5 inches is right here. So I'm just going to hold right down there so I don't lose that spot. And now if I come straight over from there, we're gonna mark at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm just gonna hold that there. I'm gonna grab another pin, and my marking on my sewing gauge is kind of gone, but right here is that point. 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so my pins that are going perpendicular to the seam, these are just holding the whole thing flat. And I know that my pins that are going parallel with the seam, that's the actual where I'm going to sew. Okay, so, and I'm looking at the little space here created, not the entire pin. I'm just using this little spot as marking. Okay, so I got my first one down. Okay, so we're going to move along. Our next piece of information is 5 inches down from the underarm. We're taking 1 inch. Okay, so let's measure again. Underarm is up here. Put the edge of the roller at the seam, and just kind of work it down here. It's all folded up and crazy, but we just have to do it a little bit at a time to get there. Okay, so here is, there's the 5 inches down. So I'm going to hold right there. Turn my ruler sideways. The seam line on the 1. Hold it. And over here at the edge of the roller, that's where my spot will be. So I'm going to just stick that right in. And that's going to be my spot where my sewing is. Okay. So we have our first one here, and then we'll come out to our new one here. Okay, and then our final one is going to be 6 inches down from the underarm. So let's measure our final one. Underarm here, edge of the ruler, all the way down this line. Okay, here's where 6 inches is. I'm going to hold there. And we had written down that it was going to be 5/8 of an inch, 6 inches down. So turn the roller sideways, find that 5/8 of an inch, put it right on that line, hold it. And mark it with a pin, or you could mark it with a pencil or chalk or something like that. All right, so what I have done here is I've transferred all the information that we had by putting the pins on the outside of the garment when the client was here. We ripped it open and we transferred that information to the inside of the garment so we can now sew a new seam. So this looks like a mess here, and it would look more clear if you didn't use pins as your marking where you're going to sew, but I just use what I have on hand and it works fine for me. So what we're going to do here is, this is the bottom, up here's the underarm. We're going to remove that 5/8 of an inch here. We're going to travel up like an imaginary line up here, up to our second point, which measured 1 inch away from the seam, and then we're going to come back in and sew right here, and then we're just going to taper it off into the original seam, leaving the underarm alone because she was happy with the fit up there. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to do kind of like a tapered off seam down here. It's not going to be the full 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to kind of have an imaginary line where I have over here, which was our second point, the 1 inch. I'm going to go straight through that 5/8 and just continue that trajectory this way. And since it didn't meet all the way back up with the original seam here, that means this will continue, the trajectory will continue into the skirt portion. So that's why we had to remove the skirt so that we can continue that there. Okay, so now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew on this. Okay, I'm here at the machine and I'm going to put the dress in under the presser foot here, And just to begin, I'm going down here and I'll just put the presser foot down and line it up right on the old seam. Okay. So I'm starting with my presser foot, so my needle's about to hit down on the old seam. So I'm just gonna sew with a straight stitch, everything normal settings. And I'm just sewing on the old seam to begin with. I can start with a back stitch. Just to lock that in. I'm gonna remove this pin. Okay, so now I can see my first point here. We're about to approach right here. Just to double check, since I was a little large on how I put that pin, I'm just going to double check where 5/8 of an inch was. Okay, and it's going to be right there. So right there where that pin begins. So there's a little bit of imaginary line drawing in your head in sewing. So I'm just going to kind of point my presser foot and sew a straight line from where I am, which is the original seam, to where I want to be, which is right there. And I'm just going to sew straight over there. And if you're not into this kind of thing and you need to have a line drawn, then take a roller, go from here, put it to where over there, and just draw a straight line and sew on it. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to aim for that point. Okay, so now here's my next point. This is the one that measured 1 inch away from the seam, and it was the one that was 5 inches down, so there it is. So again, I'm just gonna aim towards it and just drive straight towards it. I'm gonna remove the pin and hold it down with my fingernail to remember where it is. Okay, I've reached it, so now I'm actually gonna put the needle down and lift the presser foot and just pivot to my new point, which is right here. Okay, so this space in the pin here, right here, this is the third point right here. So I'm now going to just put my fingernail to hold it so I can get that pin out of the way, and put the presser foot back down and just drive straight towards it. Okay, so we've hit our 3 points, and now, like I said, we're going to just continue that trajectory. So we're just going to continue going in the direction we were going. Okay, so that's it. Here's the needle. Take it out of here. Cut. And show you what we just did here. I'm going to remove the pins. Okay, so we have a new seam. So here is our old seam, and there's our new seam. Perfect. So we're going to repeat this for the other side of the outer, and then I'm going to show you how to do the continuing onto the skirt portion, because that was the original seam, that's the new seam. This new amount needs to be taken from the skirt portion and then be tapered off, onto the original seam. So that's what we'll do next. The biggest challenge of working with pieces that are already put together is you don't get to do it inside out and flat and nice, and sometimes it's hard to even know where you are on the dress. So here's where we need to be. Here's the skirt outer. So I can just, here it is, flip it. Okay, so here is that seam, So it is actually separate from the lining. This is not the lining. This is a second layer for the outer. I can't get that seam open because of this little top stitch, or I mean this connecting stitch, so I'm going to rip that open just enough that I can get that seam to flop open. Okay, so I have my seam here, and I'm going to again pretend this has not been sewn yet, and I'm putting my two pieces right sides together, getting it all nice and flattened out, and placing some pins just perpendicular to the seam. These are just to hold everything flat. Okay, now remember what we're doing here is this is the skirt portion that's below the bodice. We just need to continue that stitch because up here we took some away from the seam, and we just need to have it continue down until it meets up with the old line. And then up here, this part doesn't count as that because the actual piece will begin right here where these lines are. So we're going to take a measurement of how much was removed at the bottom of the bodice in our last seam. So let's get back in here. Okay, here is that seam. And how much was removed. See, these little tiny dots here is going to be where it is sewn to the skirt. So that's where we want to measure that old line. Okay, so it's a little less than 1/2 inch. It's about 3/8 of an inch. So now return to the skirt portion here. And then this little section, these little stitching holes you see, that's where it's going to be actually attached. So we want to pick up that old seam where we left off. So I'm measuring along those little dots from that seam line, the original seam line, that's the side seam of the skirt. I'm going to make this go more perpendicular so we don't get confused. Get a new pen or a pencil and mark. Here's 3/8 of an inch. So here's where that old stitching line will pick up. So we will stitch from here and then just in a nice gradual taper to the original side seam line. So let's do it. Okay, so here's my skirt portion, which is flipped inside out, and so my side to side pins are the ones just holding it flat, and then my up and down pin right here is the one that's marking the 3/8 of an inch, which I'm going to be sewing along. So let's go ahead and put this in here and sew. So all we're going to do is sew that 3/8 of an inch seam, and then we're just going to gradually taper off, meeting up with the old original seam. Here we go. And we can end with a back stitch. And that's it. Now we're ready to reattach skirt to bodice. Repeat these for the other side, and then I'll show you what to do with the lining. Okay, so now we're going to reattach bodice to lining outer. We have a hole here. We took in this seam, we took in this seam, and we're going to put them back together. So I'm going to stick my hand back into this underarm hole that we ripped open so that I can pinch together the skirt and the bodice. Okay, I'm inside there and I'm pinching it so I know where I am. And then I'm pinching it and I'm just going to pull it through the opening without letting go. And then I'm going to pin the skirt to the bodice here. And I'm going to line up the two side seams so that from the outside they are still lined up the way they're supposed to be. Oops, this way. So line them up, and then where I'm going to be sewing is where you can see those little dots, if you can see them. I know you know they're there. Just sewing right along the old line. So again, I'm just lining up side seam to side seam, sticking a pin through it, and then I'll come over to the machine and sew. Okay, so now I'm gonna put this into my sewing machine. And here's the line where it was previously attached, and we're just gonna sew it back on, starting and ending with the back stitch. Being careful to make sure you're not sewing through undesired layers that have bunched themselves up underneath your presser foot. Took it out there because I suspected I may have been doing just that. And my seam was just kind of folded over in a weird way, so making a couple strays there. Okay, I'm gonna go back in and finish attaching the bodice to skirt. Most of the time you don't have to actually get into the skirt section, and that makes it easier, but this one we did. Most of the time the underarm is where it doesn't fit well, but hers was more low at the waist. Okay. Alright. So I'm going to flip it back right side out. And you can see that we did reattach the bodice to the skirt. But you can see that this little basting stitch is showing. That's not supposed to be, so I am going to go back in and make it a deeper seam so that that's covered, but basically I'm just redoing what I just did with a deeper seam, so I don't need to show you that. So next we're going to move on to the lining. Okay, so here's the lining. So this is the side seam right here. We need to remove from the side seams, but there's boning in the way. So boning is this plastic hard stuff which gives the dress shape along the sides so that it doesn't just collapse down. So I'm actually wondering if for this particular dress if I even need to remove the boning. Actually, I don't think I'm going to take from the lining on this dress because the very top is still going to be able to go back down. So I'm not actually going to take anything from this lining. The lining's just going to be a little more pouchy in there, and that's okay. But if you were to take from the lining, most of the time you do have to because it's usually the underarm that is the issue. You would rip this up, and instead of going in and doing it inside out like we just did for the outer, you would just take this lining and move it over the desired amount, stitch it back down onto the lining, and call it a day. We're actually going to call it a day right now because I don't think we need to do the lining. Okay, so since we've decided we're not taking from the lining, now all there is left to do is to close it back up. So we're going to do this by hand. So I am going to thread up a needle with some matching thread here. And the way that I like to do my hand sewing threading of my needles is I take both of the ends of the thread instead of just one, and I put both of those ends through the eye of the needle, and this eliminates the need to tie a knot, which I find annoying because you have to tie several knots over top of each other, and then you have to try to put it in there, and then it pops through the fabric half the time anyway. So I put both through the eye, and then it forms a little loop which will serve as your replacement for your knot that you're not knotting. Okay. So So both through there, and we're going to begin here. So here's what we're about to hand sew closed. It's the hole at the top where we first ripped. So this is our strap. We just have to lay that back down inside there where it belongs. And we will get some pins. And we'll close this all back up. The reason we're not doing this by machine is if you look at the outside of the dress, there are no stitches seen, and we don't want to. When you do alterations, you want everything to look the way it looked, as close as it can, before you got a hold of it. So if there wasn't stitching on the outside before, we don't want to create stitching there. It was meant to be invisible, we want to keep it invisible. Just a few pins here to hold it in place. Okay, and you can see this was sewn by machine before, but that's because they had the luxury of doing this inside out the proper way, and we are doing this after the fact as an alteration. So we have to do it by hand to retain the invisibleness. Okay, so here's what I was talking about with my method. So I'm going to take my first stitch, and to make this invisible, I want to barely grab up enough fabric. I have my finger on the underside, which is actually the right side, and I can feel that that needle did not come through. So I have grabbed it up enough that I have closed the two materials together. Now I'm going to pull the needle, and before I pull it all the way, see that loop? I'm going to stick my needle into the loop. Then when you pull it tight, that's your stopping point. So we didn't have to tie a knot. Okay, so we're just going to sew. This will take a little bit of time. Sew all the way down here and close it, but you're just going to go down the line. You can do really any stitch that you think looks okay. It just needs to be invisible from the front. That's all that really matters. Nobody's going to be bothered about your hand stitching on the inside as long as it looks pretty much straight and okay. So I'm just kind of doing a little stitch forward and then come back a little bit. I don't even know what you call this, but I will do probably 2 lines, since there were 2 lines before. I'll do one here and then another one here, but I'm not going to worry about making it a nice solid line or anything, just as long as it holds everything shut. The other benefit to doing this method is you're sewing with a double layer of thread, which makes it stronger. Since it's not done by machine, that makes it a little more weak, but when you do it with a double strand of thread, it kind of increases the strength a little bit. If you wanted this to be a solid, I guess you could come from here all the way back to the old one, like that, like a little chain, maybe you might call that. And go forward. Yeah, that looks nicer. I think I'll do that to create a solid line. So here's where I am, and then I'm going to insert my needle in where the previous stitch ended, right there. Making sure I'm not coming through to the front. I can feel it on the other side. And then emerging over here into the unsewn area. And I'm just going to repeat this, and I'm going to do it again and do it for the other side. So that's basically it. We will be done here after I finish that. The only other thing is, if you remember when I ripped this hole open, there was like a little, what I would call a tacking stitch down in here that kind of held the outer to the lining. So I guess I'll just redo that by hand just because it was there before. So that's basically it, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe.